Are you moving closer? Oh, it's so nice. I love when people want to sit in the front row. Usually everyone wants to sit in the back. That's great. And then you have more access to the panelists this way. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I'm Kristy Roschke. I'm the director of the News Collab here at the Cronkite School and study and teach media literacy classes here. And I am your moderator tonight. And we have a really exciting panel of interesting and informed folks, which I will whom I will introduce in just a moment. As you know from the title of this Cronkite Live, we're here tonight to talk about the time-honored tradition of candidate debates. So in theory and often in practice, debates are an opportunity for people to learn more about where candidates stand on top issues and also to introduce lesser-known candidates to a broader audience. We also know that debates can be really compelling in conveying a candidate's likability. As we saw, it's always talked about when we talk about debates, the first nationally televised debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon in 1960, and the impact that televised debate had. So some 2020 data from Pew Research indicates that debates still do draw a large audience, even in sort of like this media fragmented environment that we live in now, and that a majority of voters still find debates at least somewhat helpful in deciding who to vote for. But you could also maybe argue that in the digital age, debates often are a lot more, or maybe more, about the grudge match sound bites that come out of these events than the substance of a candidate's platform. So when I was announcing that I was doing this, my colleague, Cronkite Professor of Practice Dan Gilmore, shared with me that he had wrote in 2011, so a few years ago, for The Guardian, an op-ed about debates. And his argument was that given the tools for communication we have in the digital age for engaging in conversation and bringing people into the practice, making it more participatory, that we should be rethinking the sort of standard debate format as televised and just really a function of the candidates, to focus more on the true intent of the debate, which is meant to be debating those key issues. But instead, especially in recent years, it seems like the takeaway from a debate really just becomes a fact-checking exercise, right? So how much of the Pinocchio scale can we attach to each one of the candidates' comments? And the fact that post-debate coverage, and particularly at the national level, often centers on who won and who lost, it really just kind of feeds this horse race political coverage mentality that is increasingly being challenged and by media critics and folks within the industry. But this is mostly talking about national debates, right? So at the state and local level, candidate debates can be especially important because news coverage of local races is often quite scant, and it can be very difficult to find out about who those candidates are in your local races, and so debates become even more vital. But even sometimes locally, debates can devolve into something that's more of a circus than an actual useful exercise, and that detracts from the issues. So we're here to talk about, is there a better way to do this, or do we need a better way to do this? I don't have any preconceived notions about that, and that's why I'm fortunate to be joined by these four knowledgeable people to talk about it. So your names are not in the order of the seats, so I'm looking at, we start with Roy Herrera, who is a founding partner of Herrera Arellano, I'm sorry, LOP. I practice, but not enough, obviously. His practice centers on political law. He regularly advises candidates, nonprofit organizations, elected officials, and businesses on campaign finance and election law issues. Additionally, he represents clients in government and regulatory affairs, white-collar defense, and internal investigation matters. Prior to private practice, Roy served as an assistant U.S. attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice and on the legislative staff of the late U.S. Representative Ed Pastor. He earned his BBA from George Washington University and his JD from the New York University School of Law. So thanks for joining us, Roy.
Thank you.
Next to Roy, we have Maria Polletta, who is an investigative reporter for Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting, AZCIR, and she's focused on covering inequities in education. Prior to joining AZCIR, she covered state government and politics for the Arizona Republic and USA Today Network, where she led breaking and enterprise watchdog coverage of the Arizona Governor's Office, Attorney General's Office, and State Supreme Court, and moderated local, state, and congressional debates. Maria also has covered criminal justice reform and inequality issues, economic development, and city politics over the past decade with bylines from Arizona to Mexico. So thanks for joining us, Maria.
Thank you.
Next, we have Tom Collins, who's the Executive Director of the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Committee. He's responsible for day-to-day operations for the commission, a 5-member board that administrates and enforces Arizona's Citizens Clean Elections Act, including its education and campaign finance programs. Collins was an assistant attorney general for the Arizona Attorney General's Office, focused on election law, appeals, and attorney general opinions. He clerked for Justice Scott Bales and the late Justice Michael Ryan of the Arizona Supreme Court. Welcome, Tom. Thanks for being here. And then last but not least, we have Stacy Barchinger. Did I say that correctly? I'm using your phonetic spelling, so thank you. Who has covered politics at the Arizona Republic and AZ Central since August 2021. She primarily covers Governor Katie Hobbs and Attorney General Chris Mays, and was on the front lines of the race between Hobbs and Republican candidate for Governor Kari Lake in 2022. She was named Journalist of the Year by the Arizona Newspapers Association in 2023 for her work. Stacy covered politics in New Jersey before coming to the Grand Canyon State and has worked at daily newspapers and their websites for over 15 years. Welcome, Stacy. So, geez, what an esteemed group of people. Thanks again for being here. So format is, pretty simple. I'm just going to pose some questions, and for most of them, they're open to all of you. You don't feel like you all have to answer all of the questions, of course, but if you have something to contribute, if your mic's not already turned on, you just need to turn it on, and we can go from there. So, my observations. I'm not a debate expert, too, so you're educating me as well. Generally, the format of a debate is agreed upon beforehand, right? So there's some kind of standard types of debates, but we all kind of know what we're getting into ostensibly before we go into debate. But it seems that in recent years, they are more about interrupting and name-calling and speaking over one another than following this. And I am curious to know your thoughts. How and why has this gotten so out of hand?
I can jump in.
Great, thank you.
Nobody else wants to answer. A couple things. First, I think it's kind of a reflection of the political climate in general. I think, and for as much as we being journalists hear from readers and viewers that they want more substantive discussion of policy issues, often, and this is not to say this is an excuse for going that route, but often, clicks and those sorts of metrics show that what they're clicking on is the sexier zinger or insult or, headline along those lines versus what can frankly be, pretty boring policy discussions or pretty wonky if you're not sort of in that sphere, if not everybody is doing their job about making the impact really clear. I also think it's a reflection of where we are in terms of the shift to digital. I think, having a really quick soundbite or comeback or zinger, as you said, can you turn it into a meme, right, that you can then share on Twitter? Can it be a TikTok that's quick that can get circulated? So in my opinion, I think it's kind of the convergence of all those factors.
That's great, yeah.
I would just add, and this is true of the media industry, we have to figure out modern attention spans, which are 30 seconds sometimes. And so, like Maria is saying, these quick sound bites sometimes resonate more. And I think that has led to some of the debates that are more like shouting matches. But I also don't think they all are like that. I think they can still be very helpful and very substantive.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said. I do think it's more frequent that you see this kind of thing, the shouting and the, non-substantive yelling, that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean it's most of the time. Most of the time, I think the debates are actually pretty constructive, pretty respectful. But the reason why I think the frequency has increased is kind of going to Maria's point, which is one, campaigns communicate to their voters differently now, and then voters receive information differently now. And what I'm really talking about is social media and really Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. And that method of communication rewards the soundbite, but it also rewards because you're and a lot of times, like playing to your base on those platforms rewards people being aggressive to make their base happy. And there's this whole kind of like owning the libs, right? But it's like owning your opponent, right? And you want to show that aggression by yelling at them or interrupting them or something like that. And then that gets a lot of clicks and your base is happy, which that gets to kind of a larger thing. Obviously, we're going to get into this, I'm sure, with some of your other questions. I mean, partisanship is very high. I mean, highest I've seen, and I've been in politics for about 25 years. And oftentimes that leads to candidates that are a little bit more extreme. I'm a Democrat. I'd probably tell you that it's more often on the other side of the aisle, but just to be fair, people are more extreme. And again, that leads to candidates like not wanting to talk about substance, their actual proposals, but instead just, being, combating people. And that kind of leads to this kind of yelling that we're talking about.
Yeah. So I'm going to have my second question, but some of the things that you just said spurred a little addition to that. So historically, like the purpose of a debate was to be targeted at undecided voters, to really help people who weren't sure what they were going to do, make up their mind. So I'm curious to know if you think this is still the primary purpose of debates, and if you think modern debates achieve that goal, and then kind of a add-on to that based on what you just said, because it had never occurred to me that the sound bites and the memes are potentially also being seeded by the candidates themselves, being coached by their campaigns. Like, I have always kind of interpreted that as that's the media's way of turning, a longer comment into something that's clickable. But it now, for the very first time here on this stage, occurs to me that that's how maybe candidates are being coached in the debates as well, to think in these zingers and think in these really short sound bites, to think in a meme. So perhaps they're changing the purpose as well. So if I'm curious to know your thoughts on that, but just back to the question, do you think that the purpose of a debate really is still to help people who haven't already decided decide?
I think it depends what level of race we're talking about. I think, and I, did a little extra research before this just to make sure what I was suspecting, was borne out. And it is, I will say, caveat, it's very hard to, in the research, isolate often, because debates are happening, obviously, in the middle of a political season where there are other factors and other coverage influencing people's decisions. It is hard to isolate that. But my guess and what I was also seeing was for a presidential debate, not getting a lot of undecideds, and if somebody is undecided, it's not typically, they're not typically swayed by a debate or a single debate. You see more often that people are maybe using that debate to adopt a position or to back their preferred candidate's position after the fact. Whereas, as you alluded to at the beginning, I think when you're talking about local races, even state races that are maybe not as sexy, and people are not being bombarded day to day with who those candidates are, what they're saying about each other, I think those tend to actually be much more substantive in terms of helping people decide or back up what their decision is.
Anyone else want to?
I would just add that maybe there's a difference between a debate before a primary election and before a general, right?
100%.
In the primary, you have a diehard Republican voter who's figuring out who is the right Republican for them. And as an example, in the early GOP presidential debates, even this cycle, Trump was not there, but you did see, some differences among the other candidates in terms of how they were, addressing the Trump question.
Yeah, I mean, it does totally depend on the level of the debate, because obviously, if you're talking about like school board or board of supervisor or city council or even the legislature, voters don't know either of these candidates, right? They've just never heard of them. Their name ID is very low. Whereas the presidential is going to have 100% name ID. So it's a little bit different because there's really not going to be that many people that don't have a formed opinion of either Trump or Biden, for example, like this coming presidential election, right? But the question is should the purpose of the debate be to inform that undecided voter? I'm jaded, so I think most people are not undecided. I think because of, and this goes back to my earlier comment about how partisan things are these days, the percentage of people that really truly, and if we say undecided means something like they could either vote for a Republican or a Democrat, or they're trying to choose between the two, is very small. Even in a state like Arizona that has, a high level of independence, most of the time voter behavior is still one way or the other, even if they're registered independent. So to me, I think it's just, I look at it like the debate can serve a purpose of helping that sliver of voters, but also, you need to be, even if you're a base voter, excited about your candidate. And so sometimes it does become about like giving the red meat to the people that are watching, right? Because you want them to come out, you want them to be excited, you want there to be high turnout, theoretically. And so you're giving them that too, I think. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Right. Tom, do you have anything to add?
I think that, from our perspective and the program that we operate at the state level is, and to some extent at statewide level, we do it because the law that the Clean Elections Commission, which is it's a state agency, operates under, says the commission shall sponsor debates, and it says some other things in it, basically about the commission having some discretion to do that, but the program itself is kind of a mandatory thing, at least in its existence. Attendance is not mandatory for most candidates. So, as a result, we're going to offer a debate opportunity to anybody who's qualified for the ballot, who's going to be on the ballot. So we have some specifics around independents and write-ins and stuff like that. But, so our target audience isn't really an audience of that we have in mind in the way that, for example, a candidate who's speaking to, this segment or that segment would be. We're just providing the forum.
Yeah, that's great. And so the forum exists, and it will continue to exist, presumably, at least at the state level, and the mandate sort of exists. And so making use of that as best as you can, I suppose, is a goal. So I was also doing a little bit of research before I wrote my questions, and I came across an NPR story. I think it's just from last week. I think it's post the most recent primary debate. And this is a quote from that story. Zingers, clapbacks, and gaffes are a mainstay of the political debates that have become an expected part of politics for decades now, as well as, policy discussion. So it's a pretty flippant, description of it. So I guess kind of question one is like, do you agree with that? And is NPR characterizing it as such maybe also part of the problem? But then given that they're going to write a story that says this, or air a story that says this, how important then are presidential debates in the 21st century? Are they just something to sort of scoff at, or do they really play an important role to you guys?
It's part of my job, so I guess I think it's important. although whether or not my job is important or I should have it is always an open question. I think that there's going to be value there because, look, there's a couple of lenses you can put on that question, and one of them is we have had debates as part of our political discourse, throughout basically every civilization in history. So I'm not quite convinced that 2024 America, NPR or otherwise, has the ultimate insight on this question to provide. And certainly there have been debates in other times and places that have turned, downright, violent. And so, I think that's important to bear in mind, that there's a longer history here. And I think, to everybody's point here, whether about the attention span, how people are getting their news, all these kinds of things do in fact change. I think that at the end of the day, the idea that we are going to have to find beyond all that some mechanism, some process, some forum where we can have some kind of conversation. All the people I know who are concerned about polarization, right, and a lot of what we're talking about looks at, debates as sort of at least a symptom of polarization, and Roy talked about that specifically. But everybody I know who's involved in, who believes in, trying to make polarization have less direct impact on the democratic process itself and the policy-making process, everybody wants to have some kind of place to dialogue. Mm-hmm. So whether or not we're doing that right at the commission in a given situation, we like to think we're at least involved with our broadcast partners and our and others to try to facilitate that. And in some cases that happens, in some cases it doesn't happen. But we had, I'll just give you an example, which is kind of blow your mind, and nobody probably would have, not many people watched it. But we had a 2-hour debate in the last legislative primary between now Senator David Farnsworth and former Speaker of the House, Rusty Bowers. They did not stop talking to one another. And it was moderated by an experienced journalist here in Phoenix, based in Phoenix, named Hank Stevenson. And they talked and talked and talked about all kinds of different things. Now, I think it's pretty clear they have very serious disagreement about the 2020 election, right? And there's lots of people who have, to say the least, serious disagreements and about that. Some of those agreements are not based in fact, obviously. But nevertheless, they worked through that. They talked about that specific issue at length, and then they talked about every other issue under the sun. And these are folks who are both extremely conservative Republicans, right? They are folks who are not afraid, neither of them, over the course of their political careers, to take controversial positions. They're not afraid of any of the, of being criticized for taking controversial positions, and yet they were able to do that. So, I'd like to think that there's I guess what I'd like to see over time is can we utilize this part of our democratic culture to create opportunities to better represent that dialogue. I agree with that. Now, the problem for anybody who's trying to put one of these on is there's a bunch of different logistical problems, first of all, but then the managing the candidates in the process once they're on stage, once they're here, right? I mean, it's basically between a moderator and the candidate one-on-one, and we've seen that, and that's been an issue at smaller scale, I think, since at least 2000. It certainly came up in 2012, with the CNN moderated debate between President Obama and Mitt Romney. So that when you're in the real moment, it's sort of like it's live, it's happening, and so there's a positive there, I would argue, that says, well, at a minimum, you're going to get to see how people behave and what they think is appropriate in circumstances, and that's not, from my point of view, as negative as that is as a human experience, right? Do you want to sit and watch people be mean to each other or whatever? Maybe you don't, maybe that's not your cup of tea, but I sure as heck want to know it about somebody who's running for office, and want to know that somebody thinks that this history, that we, even in the time when even our civics education is now fraught, I think even the most sort of limited point of view on civics education would still acknowledge debates as part of that thing, right? Part of that history. So, that's my long rambling answer.
Oh, that was great. Thanks.
I agree, especially that last. I mean, that raised a couple different things, different points in my mind. I do think there is something to be said for. It's kind of the other side of the coin, because candidates and their campaigns now have so many opportunities to speak directly to voters. I do think there is value at having them, essentially forcing them to talk to each other as much as you can make that happen, or answer to a moderator, or, answer questions on the fly, as Tom said, see how they behave. Now, how that plays out in practice can be very tough, especially when, as someone who has moderated, if you are trying to get through so many topics, fact check in real time, follow up with certain, give equal time, it's admittedly easier said than done, but I do think there's value there, and also value in getting candidates on the record on some of these things. I moderated what was, I think, ended up being the only debate between Sinema and McSally, which, as you sort of referenced, there was a lot of drama leading up to that to even get both of them on stage for that single debate. But that was the opportunity for people to see how they interacted and what they said. And, Sinema in particular had been very inaccessible, even to journalists and everything at that time. So even though it was a limited opportunity to force them to answer questions and talk to each other, at least there was that opportunity.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that was said right now. I think there's kind of the philosophical piece, which is like, our debates, do they have value? Are they worth it? And to me, I think it's absolutely yes. I mean, I'm a political nerd. I really care about the discourse. That's why, one of the reasons why I do what I do. And I think it is a good thing for political candidates to have to go in front of the voters and explain themselves, right, in a moderated format. So that's a good thing. There's value in that. Now, of course, the practical side of that is where things get difficult, right? Because one, you got to have two people that actually believe in the concept, right? Like they want to go up there and actually debate each other and have a real discussion, which that can get difficult sometimes. And then you get into and I can't even imagine what it's like to actually moderate one, because that would be really difficult, particularly with some of the people we all know. But there is that practical reality. Like, do you have a strong moderator? What's the format look like? Is it timed? Are there controlled topics? That kind of thing. And again, I'm approaching a lot of this from the campaign perspective. You want to make sure that your candidate is in a format that's going to benefit them, at least the most possible, given whatever their strengths or weaknesses are. So agreeing to that is where I think that the devil in the details is where it gets difficult.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to take us too off track, but I think one element of this that is concerning to me and many others is, we're sitting and having this conversation, but there seems to be a shift in thinking on the part of the candidates and their campaigns on whether it's worth it. And can you score more by saying the whole infrastructure is biased against you and you're therefore not going to participate? I mean, we've seen that with Donald Trump, of course. We've certainly seen it with other candidates. And so I feel like that's a bit of an alarming shift that we're noticing on the part of the candidates, because obviously, as we've all discussed, if they take themselves out of even participating in that opportunity, doesn't even give folks the chance to talk about whether that was worthwhile or helpful to them.
Sure, yes.
I would just chime in with a real world example from 2022. I covered the gubernatorial race, right? You had Katie Hobbs, now governor, up against Kari Lake. Hobbs didn't want to debate Lake, and her stated reasons was Lake is an extremist who deals in conspiracy theories, and can you have a substantive discussion there? Our coverage of that whole cycle, we really tried to include voter voices. And we found, these are points that have been made, but in talking to actual voters, Democrats were still going to vote for Katie Hobbs. But we know the swingy independents here in Arizona that can really make a difference. They were sort of mixed. They said they would like to see something more substantive, maybe like an interview with the candidates, one-on-one, which is ultimately what happened, with a little bit of drama mixed in there. Or, there were a couple I spoke to who said kind of this point of, I want to see how they answer tough questions. They're going to be the most powerful person in the state. How will they handle controversy and scrutiny? So I think it still can be a deciding factor for some.
That makes a lot of sense, because if you've ever listened to a candidate give a speech, everything is so scripted, and even on social media where, you guys mentioned sort of that direct connect to the audience. That all is still so scripted, even if it's not scripted, And this is the one place, not that they're not prepped and they don't have their answers also scripted, but where anything could happen, and like to your points, the moving like the different pieces of that puzzle, you just don't know what's going to happen until you're in that situation. And so I appreciate, and that's why they don't want to do it, right? It's like maybe they don't know how they're going to react. So that was great. And Maria, go ahead, Tom.
Well, I think to that point, I mean, I do think that generally speaking, I and maybe this is a question for Roy, but I do think that candidates in general, even in our legislative debates that are can tend to be relatively little watched, especially if they're not in a district that's a high profile district. There's an apprehension, and I'm sure you deal with this in day-to-day life, that just there's the apprehension that folks who go into politics have about getting caught saying the wrong thing at the wrong time or having the wrong sound. So there's one thing we were talking about earlier, getting the right soundbite. But the flip side is getting the wrong soundbite. And, and I'm not sure, my assessment of that, has always been that, first of all, just don't speak in sound bites, which is what I do.
Although I will say that last thing you said was a good soundbite. The flip side is getting the wrong sound. I feel like I saw some people writing that down, and that's going to end up in some of their reports.
Right. That was no. It was more. It was the wit of it, actually. See, I grew up watching William F. Buckley, so this is why I talk like this. But in any event, I don't know why candidates are so terrified of this sound. I mean, what are they going to say that's so bad, given every other thing that they've done and all the interactions that they've had with people? With obvious, exceptions that are big, in terms of their imposition on the political sphere, but regular folks, regular politicians, I guess the stakes are shouldn't be any different for that than they are for being interviewed by Stacy or being interviewed by you or any other interaction, and so I'm not sure. I've never quite understood the apprehension of getting caught saying, the wrong thing,
So Maria, you touch on this in your remark. So I'm going to bring it up again. As you said, Donald Trump refused to participate in any of the Republican primaries, and assuming he becomes the Republican nominee, which seems to be the course we're on, we've got a Trump-Biden rematch, as it were. Do you think he'll agree to debate Joe Biden, or I guess even the other way around? And what do we lose or gain if a debate or debates between them don't happen? I mean, do you think that's even in the realm of possibilities? I suppose not that you can conjecture for certain, but what happens if we don't have a presidential debate?
I mean,
Well, I have a client in the presidential campaign, so I got to be a little bit careful on what I say. You can probably guess which of the two is my client, but not that I would have any inside knowledge about their thinking about this. I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. I mean, Trump is a little hard to predict because, well, generally, but even on this topic, because he has said, I want to debate a zillion times, but then he's like, but I don't want to debate pursuant to the Commission of Presidential Debates, right, which is how we've done it historically. So it's like, okay, well, you don't want to debate the way we normally do it, but you do want to have debates under your terms, and that's what kind of going back to the same problems, the practical problems we have. But as far as what we lose, I mean, I don't know. I kind of go back to the point that I made earlier, which is name ID is 100% for both of them. It's a rematch, if anything. So I kind of think voters already know. Now, of course, issues might be slightly different. We're dealing with things that are slightly different on the ground in the real world than maybe we did in 2020. So maybe asking them about that is useful, but they're going to be asked that during the course of the campaign anyway. So I guess my short answer to that, I'm not sure we really lose that much.
If I could add on to that, I think my concern about the presidential debate is, we had the executive director of the Presidential Commission on Debates come and speak to a working group on debates that the commission held over the course of 2023. And talking about their processes and all their evolution over time. I think that I feel somewhat informed by that, and I think the thing that I get concerned about is, how many different norms are we going to give up in this sort of aberrant situation? If it turns out that we don't have a presidential debate, that will have a cascade effect, right? Because any other candidate who, if it's successful as a strategy, another candidate, I mean, it's just like, the NFL. I mean, one offense works, everybody's going to have that offense. But that's, just to go back to my lengthy prefatory comments, I really see this debate, the idea of debate, as really one of the building blocks of what a public dialogue is that operates in a democracy. So I would like to see more, like in that type of NPR type story. I'd like to figure out a way to carve out what's particularized to the particular presidential candidates we've had for the last 3 cycles. What's particularized to media consultants, and then what voters have to say, and if we can start to identify those things. But I do think we need to start to have on a lot of different issues. We need to start defending democracy in a way that is not focused exclusively on, but includes obviously the right to vote. For anybody who's eligible, and to make sure that their votes counted, right? We need to have a broader dialogue because even if a debate in the future is not an hour-long sit-down, even if it has some way of being adopted into a more of a TikTok experience, which is possible. I mean, I don't know how it works yet, but it's
I feel like
possible.
viewership maybe would be
the
most it's ever been in the world.
Right, whatever that is. I think that I worry about us being too smart and too wise and too in the know, and so in the know that we know all the stats. We know it's not going to move this needle or that needle, so it falls under the weight of it's not efficient. And democracy is not intended to be efficient. Right? I mean, that's what Thomas Friedman is constantly writing. So I think that that's my fear, is that the trickle-down consequences of not having a debate this year will shoot through the consultant industrial complex, convince candidates this is a way to go, and we'll really lose something. And we'll look back and we'll be like, remember that time when we used to have folks, have to answer at least some questions from somebody in a situation where they literally couldn't get to their consultant to answer it for them. I think that's a real loss. And so, that's part of what, at least in terms of, my board, that I work for, and the staff member, my colleagues on staff. I mean, that's, we really value this as part of the democratic process, in a way that may seem idealistic, but it's something we want to try to preserve that function.
So I really appreciate that comment, and that the notion that as a tradition and a norm, it's important. The form and the function maybe slightly less so, and with that in mind, so I was going to ask, I have a series of questions, but given the time and we want to leave time for the audience to ask some questions, I'm going to sort of lump this into one super question that doubles as maybe closing remarks. I had the question, are debates more important and effective at the local level? But even before we started this conversation, you had already convinced me that they are, maybe it's not more or less, but they are vital at the local level for very specific reasons. And then a lot of what you all have talked about tonight has really been, it's the spirit of the debate, and it's what it brings to the audience that you can't get in another place, that we're trying to preserve and carry forward. And so hence the reimagining debates. If we agree that having those extemporaneous conversations is critical to the election process and people getting to know their campaigns, I would just ask each of you, and we can go in whatever order you choose, based on your relative experience, both in the format or in however you are, however you come to the debate, how can we, what ideas do you have or thoughts do you have for moving the debate forward, given the things that we've just talked about, the attention span, maybe the sometimes less than the 100% ID of the candidates, like the recycling of people that we already know. And so what thoughts do you have for making this, if not, maybe better is not the right word, but more attuned to and appropriate for the media environment and the people that are tuning in, as they say?
I mean, I'll go first because I don't know the answer.
Well, I wouldn't expect, if any of you actually have, I have a 5-point plan and we're done, that's great.
I have that here in my bag, yeah.
Wonderful. But yes, so any ideas, all ideas and thoughts are welcome.
No, I mean, I think it's very important to have your candidates in the same place at the same time, but maybe we think about, do we ask them, or does the moderator ask them 2 questions at a time and it takes 5 minutes and ends up as a TikTok experience, I think, as Tom called it, versus an hour long. And that just caters to attention spans, I would think, and maybe would make some of the debates more appetizing to the candidates who just don't want to show up.
A little less intimidating, maybe, too, if they wasn't, not such a spam. Right, I like it. Next.
So we've, what we've done at the commission over the course of the past several election cycles is we try to do some things differently that we think are, and have all of them work, probably not, but we certainly have tried to take some specific steps to try to improve the debate process. So what have we done? First thing we did is, for many, many years, we did our debates with essentially professional speakers, sort of a speakers bureau of people who are sort of paid to show up at things and moderate them, not necessarily journalists. So one of the things we did is we started to work on our legislative debates directly with local journalists, including in many cases journalists who cover the community of the district. So, for example, for the district that used to go in through from sort of the south side of Tucson through Sahuarita, the editor of the Green Valley News has been our moderator for in other situations we've had more local. In other cases we've had more capital-based reporters, depending upon how it works. So that we've done that. We've moved our legislative debates from sort of local locations where they usually were really hotel ballrooms, of like a Garden Inn or something like that, online onto Zoom. That actually we've seen candidates be able to use that format better. First of all, they're actually on camera. It's not this camera in the back of the room sort of trying to capture all of them. And candidates have been able to then turn around if they thought they got something, a line off they liked. We've seen them turn around within, not very long after their debate ended and get that up on Twitter. And that seems to create now that's right, that's a weird incentive, right? Because it incentivizes the thing we all don't like, but it does incentivize attendance. So that's another thing. The other thing we've done over the last 2 cycles, we've done a survey with a locally based pollster where we actually try to get essentially voters from different demographics and, to the extent we can, different parts of the state and the Phoenix metro area to identify their top issues and what they are. So all of these have been designed, and then last year this culminated after the 2022 cycle. We had this work group where we invited people from the media world. We had representatives from Arizona State, we had representatives from the parties, we had representatives from a number of different nonprofits of different ideological stripes. We had some candidates who'd run. We just had a whole group of people to talk through, what the pros and cons and what they liked, what they didn't like, and that report's on our website. And I won't get into too big a detail, but we wanted to build some consensus around the values that we're talking about here. So and then to try to implement that. And then, so those are the steps that we're trying to take. As we go into the next year, we'll have, we last week announced that we're going to work with locally based marketing firm called Reister and the Arizona Media Association, which is the professional trade association of the newspapers and television stations and radio stations in Arizona to put together our statewide and federal debates. So that is the place where we'll be looking for more ideas as we ramp that up. And so anybody who's watching this, CCEC at azcleanelections.gov is a place you can. There's other places. We don't have a TikTok because of policies that we don't control. but
you don't know how to use it either. That's the other problem. You don't know how to use it either. That's the other problem.
Personally, no, I do not. I do not. But I do know how to use Reels. I'm really good at Reels. Anyways, so
You're halfway there then.
right. So those are some discrete steps we've taken. We think are meaningful. We value, and certainly my colleagues on staff value our communication with campaigns, and we hope with our production partners and with our moderators as much as we can. We hope to make all those lines of communication as clear as possible going forward, because that's another piece of this, is the logistical piece, the sort of the card that's been played at the national level, in the presidential, has to do with, is the system inherently biased? That's less something we've experienced, but it's something we're conscious of, and we want to make sure that at a minimum, we're clear with everybody and have that level of trust as much as that's possible. So those are sort of the steps we've taken to try to maintain the integrity of this debate process in this environment. And if it has enough resilience, and if this partnership does what we hope it does, which will allow every person in Arizona to choose the place where they would like to get access to the debate. It gives us flexibility in terms of what's live and what's taped. It gives us flexibility to work with different regions where congressional districts lie. If that all goes to plan, then we'll have taken another step, we think, towards building a product that is beneficial to voters and resilient to some of these trends over the long haul.
Sure.
So
That's great. Maria?
I do like Stacy's idea of condensing it. And I think also, and this obviously would require the participation of the candidates, but it would be great, I think, if some of those could be sort of narrowed down in terms of the topic that's addressed at a given time. I know sometimes there's like domestic policy, but that's still such a huge, such a huge umbrella, and it probably wouldn't be possible, to drill down on every possible policy arena or topic. But maybe if we could do that a little bit more, we would get, be able to have the time to sort of press or hit some of those follow-up questions harder, because we wouldn't be trying to cram in so much. Another thing that when I was looking through some ideas before this that I thought was interesting was a suggestion to shift towards something a little more applied. I don't know if I would necessarily think it's feasible to be making these candidates do like full-on crisis simulations. However, if there could be something to it, when you think about job interviews, and after you get through that first round sometimes of kind of the overarching ideas, you have to do something applied, or you're given a hypothetical situation. Maybe if we could be a little more specific in our questions, kind of in that arena, versus, instead of what do you think about X, say you're in this situation, what are your first couple steps or something like that, maybe could be a way to get at it. Because if we could actually get a little bit more substantive answers, for what it's worth, I don't think it's necessarily, bad a shift toward TikTok. In fact, I've seen a lot of people who aren't or historically haven't been very engaged with news be engaged with, like a minute or two summary of something. So if we can all use that well, I think there's value there.
Yeah, I definitely do have nothing against, just to be clear.
I
The
think
social
double-edged sword,
mediaification
for sure.
potentially
if we could
of
do the
debate
Kobayashi
content.
Maru test sponsored by Clean Elections, I would be very into that.
I would
And-
love to see a simulation, but
Roy, how about your thoughts?
Well, first, I agree with pretty much everything that was already said, so it's a little hard here at the
Sorry
end.
you have the challenge of going
Although
last.
I do kind of think about watching one of my candidate clients, like, going through a simulated war game, or like balancing the budget like right in front of us or something, you know, as an option for a debate. I don't think I'd advise them to do that, but I suppose that's an option. I mean, these are all things I think to kind of like practically help the debate be better and more informative to people. So I think I'm going to answer it more in kind of an esoteric way, or again, kind of philosophical way, which is the biggest problem I think that I see with debates now on why we have this, and you know, I don't want to call it a crisis, but there's an issue about whether we're going to keep doing them. Really, again, happens at the top, and it happens in the general, and it happens between Republicans and Democrats. And so why I say it this way is to say that I think, and I'm not naive, I understand this is a longer thing and maybe it'll never happen, but I think one way to improve things, quite frankly, is to like get back to a place where like respectfulness and sort of like the idea that you can disagree with your opponent but not necessarily think they're evil is reestablished, right? And again, I don't know how you do that. That's a, you know, societal question, I think maybe, but I think that is part of the problem, right? Because you know, ultimately you don't trust the other side, and not only do you not trust the other side, you think the other side is like bad people, and I think that's hard. You know, it's a hard outlook if you want to have an actual good substantive debate, because like I said earlier, you both, like, to have a debate, need to agree to actually debate, and you need to, you know, agree on the parameters of that and allow the other person to speak, things like that. So I guess that's my sort of larger, and I don't know, you know, we are in a kind of a strange political time right now. I don't know if it's going to get better. I hope it gets better, but I think part of that comes back to like, can you respect the other side's perspective?
Well, I think that was a really nice and optimistic sort of note to end on.
And I'm a pessimist, but I'm just trying to be.
But I think you're right. I mean, someone said earlier, maybe it was Tom, the dysfunction in the debate is like a symptom of a greater problem, and so we really need to seek out the root causes, and maybe all of this disparaging of the debate as like the problem is misguided. So I appreciate that. So we have a few minutes for folks in the audience to ask some questions. If anyone is interested, you just so Dan, if you'll go up to the mic. Sure, I'll repeat it so that we catch it on the vid. No, you're okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. For the folks at home.
Feel like a nightclub singer. First, I just wanted to comment, I mean, I think on what Maria was saying here about, I think what a lot of people want to see in debates is they want to see the candidate think, right? And I mean, I'm just thinking of my own experience. Recently, I did a lot of the interviews for judges with the governor, and we would ask questions where, frankly, I didn't care what the answer was. I wanted to see them think. And there were candidates who impressed me when I disagreed with their ultimate conclusion, but I could see how they would reach it, and candidates that didn't impress me because I might have agreed with what their ultimate answer was, but they didn't give much thought to doing it. And so I think it is something that can be approached in a debate of trying to think up scenarios to make them think on the stage, and you might do one for one and one for another candidate and all that. But the question I wanted to ask was sort of a simple one, is which group of people do you think is a larger group of people? The undecided yet committed voter who watches an entire debate on, say, Channel 8, or the group of people in the base that Roy was referring to who watched the snippet of 4 seconds on social media, and they may not be as excited about the candidate, but they're now far more excited from seeing that snippet.
That's a great question.
It's sort of like asking, like, if your experience allegedly experience of listening to the 1960 presidential debate was different on radio versus television, right? So that's the, I'm sure that's true. I think as far as the debates that we've sponsored, and we're not the only people who sponsor debates in even the metro area, I suspect that the viewership is probably larger through the reporting comes out of it than that's just the nature of it.
But my question is not so much the viewership, is of the undecided viewers who will vote. How many of those people are watching that entire debate versus, the people in the base who may not be excited and see the 4-second snippet? I mean, I think the answer then informs about what the
I think it's not many. If, again, I do think there's a difference. If we're talking presidential, I don't think the undecided watching to pick a candidate, kind of as we mentioned, most people are going in, especially if they're a hardline Republican or Democrat by the time we're getting to the general. I think that could be a different situation in more local races, particularly ones that are less partisan. I also think, and this is speaking of problems that are much larger than what we're talking about right now, I do think you get into the echo chamber issue of people who are already fairly informed or are already really fired up tune in, whereas people who are maybe more apathetic or less informed or don't have a lot invested or time to invest in it, who could maybe benefit more because they're less familiar with the positions, are maybe not tuning in because that's kind of the trend. So I think that's like I said, a bigger problem just in terms of engagement overall. But I think at least for presidential, my guess would be few people going into that undecided.
Stacey, looks like maybe you wanted to.
I was just going to say, that was sort of the thinking behind my pitch for when we, rethink how these look. Is it 5 minutes on social media? Because then you could reach more undecided people who are out there. Maybe they're shrinking in number given the partisanship, but come to them on their terms when they have 5 minutes, when they're on the on public transit, or meet them where they're at.
Well, and I wonder then if that becomes a job as much for the media covering the debates as it is the debate itself, right? Like if you're focusing your local coverage on not those sound bites for the base, but what did we learn from the debate for those folks we're assuming didn't have the time to watch but really need that information? That could be an interesting, I suspect that that's probably not the main motivation of the newsroom, the moments after the debate or the day after the debate. I mean, maybe it is. I don't want to
I think
say
it
that
depends
I know,
on the outlet, frankly,
For
and the
sure.
scope and the audience.
For sure. So that's a really good point. Does anyone else have a question? Tori, you look like maybe you want to ask a question? You got to stand. Yeah, there you go.
Hi,
There you go.
my name is Tori Gantz. I recently graduated from the Cronkite School, and I'll be covering, this election in Arizona as a freelancer with national outlets. So I want to get kind of your two-pronged perspective on the campaign side, which is, I actually wrote an article a little over a year ago for Cronkite News with a Clean Elections Commission source called The Debate on Debates. So read it, compare your own responses if you're interested. But thinking about some of the discourse tonight and how debates, depending on, of course, the election, can be serving to the campaigns and the candidates themselves, as opposed to voters, given the competitiveness, given the prep that campaigns go into. I wonder, participatory democracy could be great to encourage at this time. How do we feel about something like a town hall for candidates, one-on-one? And then the second prong of that question from a journalist's point of view is Stacey, you commented a little bit on how you cover or had hoped to cover, or how the Republic covers campaign debates, including that voter commentary. But what is our duty? Do we cover the debate itself? Is there already enough top-down voice for the candidate that way in the forum? Can we frame things around the voters without covering the debate? What sort of advice maybe do you have for students here who are trying to practice public, participatory democratic journalism as well? Thank you.
I want to be respectful. I know Roy said he had a hard stop, so if you're okay? Okay. I was going to let you go first if you just had to jump up and run away. Okay. All right. Great questions. Thoughts?
The first question was how we feel about
The town
town
hall.
hall type format. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was something I meant to touch on earlier, because I do think there's a lot of value, and Stacey touched on it also, in terms of, getting questions directly from voters, whether that's in a town hall format or ahead of time asked by the moderators. I think in a town hall format, you still need to have somebody running the show, because if it, and this happens in moderated debates too, if it's just the question and the answer and no follow-up, that can kind of be a free-for-all for just, I guess, misinformation, for lack of a better word. And again, that's a broader topic, right? Like being able to fact check things in real time. But short answer is I do think there's value in that format, and value in not having all your questions come from journalists who are, not necessarily purposely, but I mean, the impact is telling people what to care about versus taking what voters are telling you they care about and weaving that into the experience.
I would, to your journalism question, I mean, absolutely cover the debate, right? Like, presumably, these are candidates that you have been following for some period of time, and so as a journalist, you're looking for what is new, right? If there isn't anything new policy-wise, maybe it is more about the demeanor of the candidates, but also, that's one story in 2 years of coverage that you will do on an election cycle, and I absolutely think that's worthwhile. At the Republic, we think a lot about alt format things, like 5 takeaways from the debate. So if a reader has 2 minutes and they didn't watch it, but they want to catch up, that's how we kind of speak to them. We just make it a point to try to talk to not typical voters, right, who are in this state, to ask them what they care about, what they think about issues that, people who are in like the political bubble tell us one thing, but we always try to include those voices. During the 2022 cycle, we actually put together a panel of, they were not readers of the Republic. We gave them subscriptions. They were representative of the whole political spectrum, a very diverse group, and we met with them 3 or 4 times just to ask them to gauge our coverage. And we got a lot of feedback about, what we were doing right, what we were doing wrong, and just, I think it's very important to try to include that perspective and those voices either in actual coverage or in shaping how we cover things.
Yeah, I would just add, from the campaign perspective, a town hall is, just from a voter perspective, I love town halls, but from a campaign perspective, there's a little bit more of a wild card to that, right? Because obviously you're getting real people asking the question, and even in a town hall where you may know what is going to be asked, it's still a matter of the candidate interacting with this person, right, as opposed to a journalist. And so, oftentimes campaigns will be worried about that, right, because there's actually some real world relationship that you have to establish, especially if it's on TV. So hopefully you have a charming candidate as opposed to an awkward one, right? But I think the other question about is how coverage is done. There's always this a debate, are you covering it, and I think you kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, are you covering it as a horse race, or are you covering it as a substantive debate? I actually think both are valuable, personally, because it is a binary choice. People are going to have to vote for one or the other, at least how we do it now. And so the horse race is important. It also informs candidates' strategy when they go into the debate, that kind of thing. But then also the substance ultimately is most important, because we are there to hear what the candidates have to say, what their vision for whatever they're running for is, right? But I don't think there's a problem, I've seen that in kind of how you do it with the 5 takeaways. One takeaway might be well, the polling shows that this person is losing or winning. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And then another takeaway might be well, their answer on what to do with school funding, they differed here, and that's valuable too.
Thanks. So we are over time, so I will say thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much to our wonderful panel for this really great conversation. I think we do actually have some tangible ideas for how to move debates forward, and I can't wait for the crisis response in the next debate. So thanks again for participating. Very much appreciate it. Thank you all for being here, and hope everyone has a great night. Thanks.
Thank you.